I am so pissed off right now because I am re-recording this entire thing. Hello my little hatchlings, and welcome to a series of videos where I redesign my old characters from my old webcomic WSS or One Star Shift for an entirely new story. So, long story short, I have a discontinued story on Webtoon called One Star Shift or WSS, and if you've watched the previous video where I talked about discontinuing WSS for reasons explained in that video, then you'll already know that I'm redesigning my characters for a new story. And here I am with those redesigns at last. Starting with the first character to ever grace the WSS universe, Kalon. And since Kalon was the first one to ever exist, it's only fitting that he's the first one that I talk about redesigning. Some things you should know beforehand before I start bashing WSS Kalon. One, just for context reasons, there are 5 races or species that existed in WSS and still exist in the new story. Those species being humans, werewolves, vampires, witches, and werecats. And as you probably would have guessed from the time-lapse playing in the background, Kalon is part of the werewolf species. Second, be warned, I am a chronic sadist. I am just attracted to the angst. As in, I dumped a lot of trauma on all of my characters, especially Kalon. And that trauma dumping was very bad when I was 13. No character was or is safe from me. A lot of pain was caused in those days. Anyways, with that out of the way, let me tear apart WSS Kalon and basically point out everything that just wasn't working in WSS and concerns Kalon. Kalon was always intended to be the introverted kind of character. And who did I create? An introvert, but dialed up to 11. Kalon severely lacked social skills and became so withdrawn to the point that simply being out in public was uncomfortable, let alone in a school environment. And even talking to strangers would make him panic. And don't get me started on his trauma. The trauma I so generously gave Kalon included a dead mom, depression and PTSD to where he experienced auditory hallucinations, again a lack of social skills, and a severe phobia of guns or people who are armed with a weapon. And later on he was going to receive even more trauma, which included psychological torture. He was not having a fun time. And I hope you all now understand just how angst-crazy 13-year-old me was. I still am, but not to this extent. Also, disclaimer, I am no expert in mental illness, and being a clueless 13 to 15-year-old at the time didn't help in properly executing Kalon's character in terms of his own mental illness. But I am fixing all these issues, and I'm way more informed than I was back then. Getting back on topic, Kalon's mom in particular played and still plays a big role in Kalon's upbringing. But in WSS, Kalon's mom was the major reason for justifying Kalon's mental illness and behavior. There were other factors contributing to Kalon's depression, PTSD, and lack of social skills, but his mom ended up being the main reason for Kalon's behavior, which sometimes didn't always work and therefore caused a lot of roadblocks in the story to which I stubbornly ignored. Kalon did not go around weaponizing his issues or anything, but whenever something related to his trauma came up, his mom was at the center of it all, whether it was explicitly said or just implied. Warning just before I continue, I will be talking about the psychological torture I mentioned, so skip ahead to the timestamp shown on screen if you're uncomfortable with the topic. And so when the psychological torture part of the story would come up, his mom, who again, the sole reason for Kalon's trauma, was weaponized and used against Kalon in said torture. The result of the torture was Kalon being trapped in his own mind with an alter ego-like creature that took shape of his mom and would essentially keep him trapped, allowing said creature to control his body. So a possession thing was involved, which is complicated to explain, and therefore complicated the process. But basically it involved malicious, fear-eating spirits or ghosts which were involved in the torture in order to turn Kalon into a feral monster puppet. Which as a concept, I loved so much. Like I was ready to torture Kalon for it. Unfortunately, WSS would be discontinued after only 5 chapters in plus the prologue, 17 if you count all those chapters being divided up. And the torture stuff wouldn't have happened until chapter 50, according to my WSS timeline that I rewrote 3 separate times. But as you probably can imagine, a lot of issues would arise after the torturing would happen, adding to the pile of already existing issues. Okay, I'm going to stop trauma dumping now, let's move on. Design-wise, in hindsight, Kalon didn't look terrible in his original design, but he didn't look good either. The way he was designed resulted in him looking proportionally unbalanced between him and his clothes. Like everything was just focused on the upper half of his body, and to put it simply, He looked like he was drowning sometimes. Another thing I set myself to fix was his color palette. Kalon's colors were actually great, but the level of saturation those colors were at is what caused the major issues of Kalon's old design. For example, pure black for his hair and the darkest of gray for his fur. You could tell the difference between the colors most of the time, but they were too similar and it was not easy on the eyes. The main goal I was trying to achieve was essentially giving Kalon a place to hide with his clothes to fit his shy and introverted personality. He could just sulk away unnoticed. Also, wouldn't it be really hot in that coat? I get defying the weather because you don't feel like dressing for it, but really? Alright, enough talk about the past. Let me explain Kalon's new design, to which I am so happy and proud about. As I've said earlier in the video, Kalon is part of the werewolf species, but this new story takes place in a fantasy world as opposed to the modern era, much less in a school. And in the new world, I imagine werewolves taking on a more tribal-like presence. Their culture actually took some loose inspiration from the Na'vi from Avatar in terms of how they treat their deceased. Just a little tidbit. And so, with this in mind, Kalon was redesigned accordingly. Some elements of his old design that I absolutely needed to keep were his blue eyes, hair, fur of his original coat, and his downturned ears. These elements made Kalon undoubtedly recognizable to me as Kalon. Without them, Kalon almost seemed like a different character. Well, the point is to make him into a new character, but these elements of his old design is what made him look like Kalon. While redesigning Kalon, I thought back to a second design I did for Kalon in WSS that would have appeared eventually, specifically during and after the psychological torture part. With that aside, I decided to try and mash Kalon's original and second design from WSS as a sort of baseline, and you see on screen the result of said mashing designs. Little things I fixed design-wise is, of course, his color palette. Like I said, his original colors were great, it was just the level of saturation they were at. Next, his hair got fixed. Also longer, because males with long hair are just... Also, Kalon's second design had longer hair, which is totally the only reason why I gave him medium to long hair. You speak nothing of this. The exact fix that I did make to Kalon's hair was how the white of his hair worked. Originally, it was just a gradient, which didn't make sense biologically speaking. Kalon as a child had pure black hair and would later turn white due to, you guessed it, trauma. But hair just doesn't change color from the tips to the roots. It should have been the other way around. So instead of a gradient, the whites were fixed to just a few strands of hair that correctly ran from the roots to the tips. And that's Kalon's new design mostly talked about. Of course, I'm not close to being done explaining his new design, but the next changes to Kalon's design relates to his behavior. Kalon was never an aggressive person. He retains being introverted, but not to the level of last time. A better word to describe him now would be that he's more reserved. And with his passivity, Kalon was designed to be more equipped for jobs like gathering materials or weaving as opposed to more aggressive roles like hunting or defending the tribe. At that, you've probably realized that Kalon is taking on roles that would stereotypically be meant for women, but we don't stick to social standards here because gender norms can suck it. Besides, there's nothing wrong with men taking on more gentle and passive roles. Same goes for women who take on more dominating positions. Bottom line, respect other people. But even though Kalon is a passive person, he has a knife. A knife. My boy has a knife now. Before in WSS, the only reason Kalon would have picked up a knife would purely be for cooking reasons. But now he can stab someone. And he probably will. Of course, Kalon will still avoid conflict as much as possible because he isn't one for conflict, but tick him off enough and he'll pull out the knife. And possibly start stabbing. Long story short, he's not much of the damsel in distress that he once was. He's not a wuss anymore. He knows how to defend himself and defend himself well, so leave him alone. And on the topic of not being a wuss anymore, Kalon is no longer a social outcast. Put simply, he's not socially awkward anymore to the point where he's dysfunctional. A major issue with this anti-socialness in WSS is that Kalon wasn't committed to keeping or making new relationships. The worst example of this being his friendship with Tala in particular. They were initially childhood friends that grew apart, and the way I would eventually reunite them was not executed very well. It was basically Tala cornering Kalon because she was pissed off at the lack of contact. But now Kalon and Tala are better childhood friends who have practically grown up together. One other thing I've changed in terms of Kalon's friendships is that he's no longer good friends with Lucas. They initially started out as online friends who coincidentally met in real life. But with how I want the new story to play out, it was better to make it so that Kalon and Lucas never knew each other prior. Now on to how I fixed up his trauma, or in better words, lessened it. His trauma no longer revolves around his mom anymore. His mom still dies in the new story, just not in the same way. I don't want to dive into too much detail about that in this video, as I have a speed paint plan showing exactly what happened that resulted in Kalon's mom dying. Here's a sneak peek, but I'm keeping my silence on this. I will say that Kalon has learned very early on how to cope with the loss of his mom, therefore he's not as trauma-stricken as before, but instead of a phobia of guns to pair with the loss of his mom, it's a phobia of fire instead. In concerns of his previous depression and PTSD, I'm still deciding whether or not to keep those aspects of him, just not as intensely as before. Maybe less on the PTSD more so. Either way, I've got some researching to do because, again, I'm no expert in mental illness, and it's better to be informed about this kind of stuff than attempt to write about it when I essentially know too little. And with that, we've come to the end of the video and the end of Kalon's redesign. Again, I am so proud with how Kalon came out, like I couldn't even imagine him looking this good. If you follow my Instagram or Twitter, then you've probably have already seen Kalon's redesign along with most of the rest of the redesigns as well, as of this recording. I highly suggest you follow me on those platforms just so you can get early access to my content. This narrated video took a while to make because I had to re-record the whole thing because I hated how I tried to do it before. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe, like, and comment how you think of Kalon's redesign. Next redesign video, I will be going over Lucas Varen. When that will come out, I don't know. Anyways, thank you all for keeping me company. Make sure to take care of yourselves, and until next time, my little hatchlings, bye!